My guest today is Professor Nicholas Baragwanath. He is a scholar of music theory and history. His book, The Italian Traditions and Puccini, a major study of compositional theory and practice in the 19th century Italy, was published in 2011 by Indiana University Press. His upcoming book, The Solfeggio Tradition, a forgotten art of melody in the long 18th century, will be released by Oxford University Press in the summer of 2020. Professor Baragwanath, it's really an honor to have you on the show.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Now, before we begin, could you tell me a little bit about your background in music?
I studied as a pianist. So I left school at the age of 15. I went straight to the Royal Academy of Music in London, and I trained as a pianist until about the age of 21, when I decided that it wasn't quite for me, and I went into academia.
In academia, what was your area of research?
Well, I've pretty much covered all bases. I don't have any school qualifications, and I only got a degree by default because I actually took several courses, and they allowed me to take a degree when I wasn't allowed to get one because I was a pianist. And then after that, I went for a PhD scholarship and happened to get it. And that's what got me into academia. And I started off as an Alban Berg scholar. And I've basically worked my way backwards. So I've published on all kinds of stuff. I've done aesthetics and critical theory of the 1930s. I've done Alban Berg in the Second Viennese School. I've gone back through Wagner, through romantic music, ended up with Puccini I've written about, Italian opera.
Yes.
And I've gone further and further back, essentially. And now I'm sort of reaching right back into the medieval period in some of my recent work.
That's fantastic. Now, of course, everyone is really excited. Everyone's been asking me, when are you going to get Nicholas on the show? Because the book is getting quite a lot of attention. And so let me ask you, what sources, so the book is The Solfeggio Tradition, and how did you find your way into this topic?
When I did the book on Puccini, I basically, the book on Puccini was meant to be a study of him and his operas, but my very first chapter was going to be his educational background. And when I started doing chapter 1, I realized I knew absolutely nothing about what Puccini learned. And so the entire book became the chapter 1, if you like. It became Puccini's education and his compositional background in these kind of Italian traditions, which have been largely forgotten. And actually, during that research, I realized how little we knew, me and everyone else included, about these long Italian traditions. So I started to look back, into the 18th century to see where this stuff came from. And I found these things called solfeggi. And if you go to European archives, you'll find tens of thousands of these things. I mean, they're very, very common, but nobody has ever written about them. No one's researched them, and no one really knows what they do or did. And so I set myself a very simple question about 9 years ago. I said, okay, what are all these manuscripts? What did they do? What did they teach? How were they used? Why are there so many of them? And can I interpret and understand them? So I started there about 9 years ago. It's been a really long 9 years. I've spent most of it in archives dredging around ancient manuscripts. And I'm happy to say that I think I cracked the code, that I have actually worked out what these things are for. And the answers were extremely surprising, I have to say.
When it comes to partimenti, there are few authentic realizations of partimenti, but by contrast, do we have many examples of the solfeggi in their full form?
Every solfeggio is pretty much in its full form, yes. So it's an incredible story. I mean, one thing I will say that listeners might be surprised at is that no 18th century Italian musician was ever allowed near a keyboard until they'd done at least 3 years of solfeggio. And so partimento was not a basic study. It was for a select chosen few who were deemed good enough or suitable to learn the keyboard. And it was a completely different system because it has different functions. It has a different purpose, playing the keyboard. So the first 3 or more, literally a minimum of 3 years, they would spend doing solfeggio. And then they would say, well, you're going to be a singer, or you're going to play the keyboard, or you're going to be a composer. And that's when they would specialize. But the solfeggio training was the basic training, and it's the one that's never been written about before.
When it comes to partimenti, we have Fenaroli and Furno and those rules. For solfeggio, what sources and do we have treatises of how to do solfeggio in the Italian manner?
Sort of. The thing is, solfeggio is another thing I want to get clear from the start is that solfeggio is nothing like any modern solfeggio. So any listeners who are thinking, well, I know about Kodai method or movable do or fixed do or whatever, it's nothing like those. It's not the same as those at all. It's called the same, but it's not the same. That's the first thing to mention. We don't have a treatise because it was a craft secret. This was a secret method that was taught orally by maestro to student. And in fact, the Germans used to complain about this quite a lot. They used to say they were excluded from this art, and get quite sore about it. So we don't have a treatise, but what we do have, we have lots and lots of sources which tell us which syllables to use. So the solmization method is pretty clear. That's incontestable, really, the amount of sources we have. The secrets of how these things were actually sung, that's very difficult. And in fact, I can tell you the story of how I discovered this, if you want. It's quite a weird story. Of course. So if you look at a solfeggio manuscript, they look like melodies. So it could just be like any 18th century melody. It could be in the style of an aria or a sonata or a fugue. It could be literally anything. And it's a complete melody with a bass line usually. It doesn't have to have a bass line. So it's very difficult to interpret. You'd think, well, it's a melody. What do? You sing it? You play it? I mean, what? The secret, of course, is in how these things were sung and put together. The secret to the solfeggio tradition is knowing that music education in the 18th century was primarily geared towards churches. And this is something we tend to forget because we focus on theatres and glamorous courts and this kind of thing. But actually, the number of all the schools were church schools. If your daddy wasn't a Kapellmeister and your family weren't musicians, then you learned in church schools. That was what happened. And church schools, of course, had one main objective, which was to produce choir boys and girls and produce cantors and people for church music. So the very first thing they learned was plain chant. And this is something that's been totally forgotten. But all of the primers, all the sort of basic rules and guides and primers for kids to learn music are plain chant manuals. And they're written in a 13th century medieval notation that they have 4-line staves and staffs and they have square note heads. And this was totally current in Italy right up through the 19th century. If you go to church schools where Puccini was learning, they still had medieval notation and plain chant. And that's what you learned to do your church music.
Did they use do? Did they use ut instead of do?
No, they never sang ut instead of do because it's horrible to sing. The earliest known mention of do is actually from a guy called Doni, D-O-N-I, in 1640. And people say that it's actually the first syllable of his name, Doni. So he invented the first syllable of his name instead of ut because he didn't like ut. But they were probably singing it even before then because it's just nicer to sing. But yes, they sang do, re, mi. The thing is, they used the old medieval hexachords, and they absolutely used these. There's no doubt about that, right the way through the 18th century. Now, here I'm gonna, I'm hopefully gonna stagger you with a few little facts here.
I'm already staggered.
Here's the first one. Ready?
All right.
What happened is when I started studying the sources, I realized that the textbook or treatise was actually the plain chant manuals. I had to learn those before I could understand what was going on. So I did. I trained myself as a puer cantor, a choir boy, an 18th century choir boy, and I sang through all these plain chant manuals. And I realized something which I've since proven, and I've discussed it and shown it to many other musicians. In the 18th century, musicians could read 84 combinations of key signatures and clefs with just 2 patterns. 2 patterns. So, nowadays in solfeggio, you have to learn your alto clef and your tenor clef.
That's right,
and,
the 7 clefs.
It's just impossible. I mean, imagine a baritone clef in B major, and then it suddenly shifts to a tenor clef in, A flat major. It's almost impossible for us nowadays to do this. For an 18th century musician, there were only 2 patterns on the stave. Only 2. You only learn 2 patterns, like we would learn, for instance, treble and bass. And you could read all 84 combinations with just those 2 patterns.
Wait a second. So hold on a second. What do you mean by 84? Because I just think of
7 times 12. So 7 clefs, 12 key signatures.
Oh, okay.
So any clef, right. Any key signature. So any clef, any key signature could be read with just one of 2 patterns. It's astonishing. It's the most incredible system. The way to know this is to do plain chant.
Okay, wait, hold on a second. So this seems completely different from like you mentioned, how people now think of solfeggio as just singing exercises, sight singing.
Yeah, it's not that at all. It's not that at all in the 18th
Now,
century.
let me ask you this question, which I think would some people have asked me to ask, which is if someone has absolute or perfect pitch, where, like, for instance, A is 440, are they going to be bothered by this new system?
That's a good question. Probably yes, because it's a system for singing. And actually, when what happened is when they'd done their 3 years of solfeggio for singing, they'd learned this system of reading clefs, where you can basically read any clef. And it doesn't matter what the pitch is, because in church choirs, a cappella, for instance, it never mattered what the pitch was.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't really matter. But when you get to sort of 3 or 4 years after solfeggio, and let's say you're going to learn the violin, you suddenly then get given the violin clef. And the reason for that is, of course, that you have to know where G is, to know the G string. So the clefs were for instruments. And each clef was created for a specific set of instruments. And of course, then you do have to know the letter name and the pitch. But for singing, it doesn't matter. So it was completely movable.
So it does have some similarities to movable do then in a big way.
Yes, it does, but it's hexachordal. So it is a movable do system, but it uses a hexachord system based on the medieval hexachords.
Now, hexachord means 6 notes. How did we suddenly have 7 notes with C or T?
That's a really long question. That's a really long question. I mean, there has always been an octave in music. So, in the letter names, in the modes, there's been 7-note scales in music history going way back into the medieval period. But the partimento 7-note scale, the one that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the bass, is very, very recent. And in fact, the earliest mentions we have are around about 1715, and we don't really have mentions of it before then. It probably was around in the 17th century as an octave scale in the bass, but it's very strongly connected to keyboard music and learning to play chords from bass notes. In solfeggio, they use 6-syllable hexachords. And for those listeners who are not familiar with this, it's very simple. It's the first 6 notes of a scale. So it's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. It just doesn't have the 7 notes. And the reason for that, people think, well, why bother with something so complex? It's because if you have your scale made up of 2 6-note scales instead of 1 7-note scale, in other words, your scale outlines a tenth from the tonic to the third, or the 10th above, then the letter names remain the same in any part of the scale. So if I say do, re, mi, I can also go do, re, mi in a different part of the scale, and the letters stay the same. So once you've learned one pattern, it never has to change. Think, for instance, if I use modern scale degree numbers and I sing 6, 5, 4, 3, I then have to sing 3, 2, 1, 7, which makes no sense. In the 18th century, it was la, sol, fa, mi, la, sol, fa, mi. They both had the interval pattern had the same letters, syllables. So it's a wonderful system of learning.
Now, how are modes such as the Ionian, Dorian, Aeolian, are they relevant to solfeggio?
No, is the quick answer to that. The modes were used in Italy. I mean, I'm not going to talk for other traditions because I know in Germany they were considered slightly more important. This is a very complex history. If anyone's interested, the way Johann Fuchs notates his minor keys will tell you what you need to know about German use of modes compared to the Italian. The Italians used modes only for one reason, and that was to classify chants in church services. So the modes themselves, and again, I'm going to say something hopefully that will be very provocative and surprising, but in 18th century Italy, they never ever sang the modes. The Phrygian mode, the one starting on E, never had a Phrygian second. It was always E to F sharp. The Lydian mode on F never ever had a Lydian fourth because the B was always flattened. So the modes existed in name only. They were always sounding like major and minor scales in Italy. And again, that's something which is absolutely incontrovertible. If you go to any guide to plain chant published in 18th century Italy, it will tell you this. It will tell you that you never ever sing the Dorian mode without a C sharp, for instance.
In your research looking at the archival material, what are the key differences among the solfeggi of the 17th, 18th, and the 19th centuries? How did you notice the change as the centuries moved forward?
Okay, well, for one thing, we have very, very few 17th century solfeggi. The solfeggio there are many types of solfeggio. I mean, I've got to be careful. I don't want to get bogged down in detail here. But the kind of solfeggio people are familiar with a melody and a bass line, that stems from the late 16th century, and it's very much tied up with monody and basso continuo. So the solo song, the kind of solo song you get in Caccini and Monteverdi, this kind of thing. And initially, the first solfeggi were actually arias, where you would simply have a sketch of the aria and you would teach the aria with the sketch. So just like the basso seguente for partimento, the solfeggio started off as a kind of reduction of an actual piece, and only later did it turn into a kind of pedagogical method of writing bespoke exercises. And we don't really know when that happened. I mean, the other big difference is there are two solfeggio traditions. There's the ricercar, or the contrapuntal one, which has roots in sung counterpoint, goes way back into the Renaissance and beyond. And the other one is the aria solfeggio, which really stems from the early 17th century, and which is to do with this kind of solo song with a bass accompaniment. And the two are quite different traditions. They kind of go in parallel, and then in the 18th century they sort of hybridize into solfeggio fugues of various sorts.
Solfeggio, as people seem to know it now, happen to be these melodies. Is Italian solfeggio always tied with a bass line?
No, it's not. And in fact, this is a huge topic, because many maestros, for instance, talk about singing without the bass and then with the bass. Others, there are editions of solo solfeggi which have the words, this sounds better with a bass, so they would add a bass, for instance. It's a very fluid tradition, and I think it depended on didactic need. So whatever the teacher wanted to teach, it either had a bass or didn't have a bass, and it could have different types of bass as well.
Studying counterpoint through solfeggio, how did they study counterpoint and even composition through this art of solfeggio?
Okay, this is where I enter into my own. I'm going to have to sing for you or do a few things here.
Sure.
For one thing, the teaching of counterpoint through singing has a very long history. And in fact, anyone can look me up on this and catch me out. But right into the 19th century, professors of counterpoint at music conservatoires were also professors of singing. The two were the same subject, right up until the end of the 19th century. And that's something which surprises us, because singing teachers nowadays, you don't expect them to be teaching counterpoint for some reason. But counterpoint and singing were always completely tied together in the Italian traditions. The reason for that is, of course, that you can memorize syllable names much easier than any other way. So if I tell you that fa, mi, fa can go against the do, re, mi, you'll remember that. And that's a very simple bit of invertible counterpoint. So I can have do, re, mi, and against it I said fa, mi, fa, and that makes a nice little bit of counterpoint. And there are, of course, much more complex combinations. So the syllables were instrumental in learning how to combine melodies. But I haven't got to the really main point yet as to how these things taught composition. So let me know if you want me to tell you about that.
Oh, please. No, go ahead.
Okay, so the crucial thing about a solfeggio is how you sing it. Now, in the early stages of training, you would basically sing a solfeggio, which was note for note syllables. So like a plain chant, in other words. So if you can think of a very simple plain chant like do, re, mi, re, do, that's a simple, melody, isn't it? Note for note. Now, they were only ever sung like that, if ever, in the very first days of lessons. So students very quickly stopped doing that. They would read the syllables without singing them for quite some time to learn to score read. But when they started singing the syllables, you sang musically or with graces. So you would never sing do, re, mi, because that's not music. You would do something to it. So you might, for instance, phrase it differently. And this was called fraseggio puro, or pure phrasing. So I might, for instance, sing do, re, mi, or I could do something like do, re, mi, maybe something like that, or do, re, mi, or do, re, mi, fa. So you start to phrase things in musical ways.
Just to jump in really quickly, the Solfège d'Italie was that massive publication in France where they kind of compiled all of these solfeggio for the French population. And the editor said at the end of it, it's getting so difficult that you might as well just sing la. If what you're saying is true, is it maybe they would actually have one syllable for multiple notes at a time?
Okay, now we're getting somewhere. The Solfège d'Italie was published for amateurs. It was an amateur thing, and it had a very simplified solemnization system, the one we use in Paris nowadays, with the seventh syllable C, and it was for teaching amateurs to read music because there was a huge new amateur market, and what they needed, because there were cheap printed scores around, was how to read these scores. And Solfège d'Italie was to cater to that market. There's been quite a bit of research done on this recently. So it has almost nothing to do with the Italian solfeggio tradition for professionals. So the Solfège d'Italie was a compilation of genuine solfeggi. They're real solfeggi by Italian masters, but they're presented for amateur French market to learn to read music. So they're absolutely nothing to do with what I'm talking about.
Right. Could you elaborate a little bit more? I interrupted you. You were singing do and re, but you were adding stuff to that syllable.
Yeah, so the first thing you do is you learn to phrase the syllables in patterns. So if I sing, for instance, la, sol, fa, mi, that's a really boring phrase. If I did something like this, sol, la, sol, fa, mi, can you see I've already turned it into music, but it's the same pattern. So you learn lots of patterns like that first of all. Then it gets interesting because then you learn what are called leaps, and the leaps are intervals. So I can, for instance, put a leap of the third on everything, do, re, mi, or I can do do, re, mi. And you can put different leaps on the syllables. You can put appoggiaturas, for instance, do, re, mi. Those are chromatic appoggiaturas. I can do cerca della nota, which is a kind of big appoggiatura. So, for instance, do, re, mi. That's a kind of cerca della nota, a search for the note. And there are thousands, literally tens of thousands of ways. So if I were to teach you how to sing do, re, mi in solfeggio, we would spend around 6 years doing nothing but that.
Wait, six years, not 3 years?
Well, 3 years for the basics, if you went on to be a partimentist or whatever. If you were going to be a great singer then, or a great violinist, then you spent 6 years doing solfeggio, at least 6 years.
What is the difference between basic lettura or note reading and l'arte del canto, meaning solfeggio cantato meant with graces?
Yes, that's right. So solfeggio parlato is spoken solfeggio, and that's they used to read music from the stave and beat time with their hand. And this was basically to learn to read music, and they would speak it, so they didn't sing in pitch, they just spoke the syllables. So you would look at the stave and you would say do, re, mi, fa, sol, and then you would just beat them in pitch. So you were absolutely able to read any staff, any kind of music. And they used to do this before the voice broke because they didn't like training voices before they broke. And so these poor kids, until they were sort of 11 or something, would have to just speak syllables. It must have been incredibly boring. As soon as you start to sing them, solfeggio cantato, that's a different thing. Solfeggio cantato is when you sing the syllables, and you would never sing a plain syllable. Anyone who knows anything about singing treatises know that you sing with graces, you sing with ornaments, with accent, and that's what it meant. So you don't sing do, re, mi, you sing something else. You sing do, re, mi. You sing something that's musical in a certain style. And these were taught by the maestro. So the maestro would literally speak the syllables in certain styles, and the student would copy. So it's an oral tradition. And I can, for instance, teach you in the space of probably 40 seconds to compose a sonata exposition in this method.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yes.
So if we take a really simple pattern of syllables. Now, listeners who are not familiar with do, re, mi's, they might get a bit freaked about this. So if you think of them as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there are only 6 syllables, that's it. You can number them if you want. You can sing 1, 2, 3 instead of do, re, mi. It's the same thing. So if I sing a pattern of syllables, a really simple one, we'll have a theme that goes 1, 7, 1. That's a soprano cadence. 1, 7, 1. Yep. And then we have an answering phrase, a sort of riposte, which would be 6, 5, 4, 3. And then we have a cadence, which would be 2. That's a half cadence on 2, which is re, a half cadence. We've got 3 things there: a theme, a continuation, and a cadence. Are you ready? Now I could sing it in all sorts of different ways. So We could put a leap of a fifth on the fa. Fa, mi, fa. Now, are you ready for this? I'm going to sing it as a sonata exposition. Just those syllables, just the ones I've done. Fa, mi, fa.
Okay.
La, sol, fa, mi. La, sol, fa, mi. Re, la, sol, fa, mi, re, mi, re, mi, re. Can you see how it works? So I've just sung a sonata exposition by Mozart. It only has those syllables. It has no others. That's all it is. It's just simple phrasing. I hope you understand now that I can teach my students to write a sonata in a matter of minutes by doing this. So it's so much easier than doing bass lines and modulations and harmonies and form and all the rest. You just get a simple pattern of syllables and you sing it in different ways. And you can create music very, very quickly. That's how they did it.
How does this relate to schematic prototypes and this music schema theory? Would they be familiar with things like the printer and that sort of thing in Italy?
Yeah, it relates perfectly to that. In fact, it backs up Bob Jerdingen's theory completely. Bob Jerdingen, of course, was using partimenti as historical evidence for his schemata. But actually, of course, they first came from solfeggio because solfeggio was taught before partimento. So the students would have known a printer, for instance, as a kind of la, sol, fa, mi. The schemata that Bob Jerdingen identified absolutely correspond to the reality of solfeggio singing, but not quite. So, for instance, it's extremely rare to just have la, sol, fa, mi in a solfeggio. It's nearly always slightly more complex. For instance, sol, la, sol, fa, mi. It will be grouped in different ways.
If somebody's wanting to know the differences, they'd have to look at a lot of solfeggi to see how they kind of put that together?
Yes. The only way to learn solfeggio is that this is what happened when I started researching this. I spent 2 years looking at these manuscripts and getting absolutely nowhere, just analysing them and getting no answers at all. And then I decided that the reason was that I didn't actually know anything, that my knowledge of music theory and history was completely useless. And so I thought, well, I'm going to have to become an apprentice. So what I did was I got thousands of solfeggio manuscripts and photocopied them. And I had huge piles of these things in my study. And I started singing. I put them on the piano and I just started singing through them. And I sang through hundreds of these things. And after several months, I started to work it out. It starts to make sense. So I actually trained myself as an apprentice to be able to do this.
What was the trickiest thing for you starting out doing this?
The trickiest thing was to find evidence of how they sang one syllable to many notes, because this was a secret, and it's all written in my book, but I'm just going to tell everyone already because I don't care. But basically, for a long time I knew that they had to be singing multiple notes to a syllable because it was completely stupid and impossible to sing every note to a syllable, as everyone knows. But I just didn't know how they did that. And then it came with the word amen, bizarrely. So I often wondered why German sources sung their solfeggi to the word amen. So they would put an A on the beginning and then an amen at the end. Ah, the whole thing's ah, and then you just say men. And I thought, well, why bother with amen? I mean, these are not, why not just ah? Or why not another word with an ah in it? And then I found in several earlier sources, they talk about singing notes like amens. And it's because, of course, in plain chant and in church services, the one word that always gets a melisma is amen. So if you think of a plain chant, you'd sing your plain chant. It could be totally syllabic. And then at the end, amen, there's a melisma on amen. And so they used to talk about singing notes like amens. And then I worked it out. These were little amens, to sing like an amen. So I went back to the manuscripts and I looked for evidence, and I found it. I found that in the manuscripts, these markings have been overlooked. No one had ever noticed them before. But if you look at a solfeggio manuscript, they quite often have little straight lines above the notes. And you could mistake them for slurs, but they're a lot straighter. They're sort of straight lines rather than curly ones. These are called tratti. They're traits of vocalization. And they've got nothing to do with slurring or phrasing. They show you where one syllable ends and another begins. And they only wrote them in the manuscripts where there was an ambiguity. So normally the students, because they were trained really from simple basics through to advanced, they didn't need any markings. but we do. But sometimes in a manuscript there was an ambiguity. So a singer, there might be two ways to do a passage. So they would actually write in the traits above the melody to show where the syllables changed. And I started to write in the syllables when I saw these markings, and every single one worked. They all corresponded perfectly with the melody and the syllables. So I'd found the evidence. There is evidence in the scores as to how they did this. And basically, the worse the singer, the more markings there were in the manuscript. So for genuine Neapolitan singers, there are no markings at all. When you get manuscripts copied for other places, they start to get lots of markings put in. So the German ones have the best. The German ones have loads of markings.
I'm just so blown away by the fact that singers are such comprehensive musicians. I mean, that would be absurd today. No offense to singers, of course, but I mean, just like I was so stunned that people like Popora and Farinelli just were able to do this complicated stuff. Let's go on to pedagogy for today now. Now, if I'm interested. Let's say by royal decree, you're in charge of solfeggio training for children all over the world. Now, how would you start this from the very beginning?
Well, I mean, there's a good question there as to whether we should be doing this again. I mean, that's for someone else to answer maybe. But I mean, how this is mined and used for benefiting modern education, this is something I leave to experts in pedagogy, because I don't have the answers. I don't know exactly how to revive this or to use parts of it or whatever. But if we were teaching it properly, if we were teaching it as it was taught in the 18th century, it has to be taught like a language. So it's not a textbook thing. It's got to be practical. So the very first thing you'd have to teach would be score reading, and score reading using hexachords and far clefs of plain chant, because then you can read every clef, every key signature with just two patterns. I know how to do that, but I still find it difficult because I've been trained in the modern way. So whether we want to do that, probably not. But that's the first lesson. Then when a student has been able to read music, and so we could take that for granted and just say, look, let's just stick to treble and bass clefs, modern C major, let's just do that. What we would start with is the 6 syllables and putting them into simple patterns of phrases. And that actually teaches rhythm and phrasing and form. So if you say to a student, look, let's take the notes do, re, mi. What can you do with those? You can spend hours putting those 3 notes in different patterns and different shapes. And then when you get the 6 notes, and then when you put the fa above la, the little semitone above la, which you're allowed to use in solfeggio, you can pretty much make any melody. So the first thing to do is how to put those notes into melodies, in rhythms. The next thing, of course, is how to sing them. And you start very, very simply. So you'd say, let's do a melody with some leaps of the third. Do, re, mi. Yep. Leaps of the third the other way, filling them in. Do, re, mi. Those are filled in leaps of the third. We then start to do some ornaments like turn figures. Do, re, mi. We might do appoggiaturas, we might do trills, we could do all sorts of stuff like that. And the system gradually builds up more and more complexity. And I've done this with students. I've taught my own students at university over a period of about 6-7 weeks. And I can promise you now, they are composing beautiful melodies, in the style of 18th century maestros. And you can't really go wrong when you do it, because you just know what sounds right and what doesn't. And you can learn counterpoint too, very, very quickly. You can learn really quite advanced counterpoint very quickly. So if you, for instance, know that the syllables la, sol, fa, mi compare with fa, mi, re, do, which is a printer basically, then you start to sing them in different ways. So instead of, for instance, la, sol, if I sing, I'll do an advanced one for you. La, la, sol. You'll find that will actually pair with someone else singing the same things in counterpoint. And we can create really astonishing counterpoint fugues within minutes, literally a matter of minutes in the lessons.
That's amazing. Now, with your knowledge now, how do you look at scores now? You're a trained pianist. Do you look at your old piano scores a little differently?
Well, I can't listen to the music in the same way anymore. One thing that I do hear, which people might be, again, I'm going to try and throw something provocative out there. People don't seem to realize this, but musica ficta was alive and well in the 18th century. So if you're, by that I mean unnotated accidentals that were added in performance. So I know the real meaning of musica ficta, so don't write in. But for present purposes, what I mean is unnotated, singing an accidental that isn't written. And they did this. So if you learn plain chant, it comes very naturally, because in plain chant you do it all the time. It's one of the basic things in plain chant. You have to add accidentals to get rid of dodgy intervals, this sort of thing. And they were very, very used to this. So in a solfeggio, they would sharpen subsemitones, they would mitigate tritones, they would do all sorts of the stuff that Renaissance scholars know about, and they still did it. And I found that in solfeggio manuscripts, the ones that are for apprentices in Naples hardly have any accidentals in, very few sharps. When the same solfeggio was copied for lessons in Vienna or Paris, suddenly there's all sorts of sharps and flats in there. And the evidence suggests that, well, they must have sung them. They must have done this, but without notating. And the evidence of this is there, plain and simple, in plain chant. So it tells you to do that. So I conclude that in a lot of 18th century music, especially early 18th century, we're actually missing a lot of accidentals.
You've looked at so many scores and the archival material. What are the differences between the old style and I guess the newer popular style of Mozart? Like for instance, the strict style, the older, more church-like, and I guess as we get more into the popular style of quote unquote classical.
Yeah, I mean this is really complicated, and it's as complicated as it is in music history. So, for instance, it depends what the music's for. So, a composer like Mozart, for instance, if he's needed to write in the old-fashioned stile antico strict style for church, he can do that. And if he's needed to write something funny and galant and up-to-date, he can do that too. The syllabic underpinning, the solfeggio underpinning remains the same. So, I mean, it's incredible, but a La Sol Fa Mi is a prinner, which could be a very galant Farinelli-style prinner, or it could be part of a fugue. It could be in counterpoint as a fugue, and it's the same. It's the same substratum, if you like. So it's really a matter of musical style, and it's a matter of the expertise of the performer stroke composer. So anybody can say La Sol Fa Mi, that's not difficult. But to say La Sol Fa Mi in as many ways as Mozart could say it, that's difficult. Or in as many ways as Bach could say it.
Did you have choral training in your musical development?
Oh, yes. I go right through the British choral tradition, which is a wonderful apprenticeship. So, yeah, all the way through school, I was in school choirs, and I sang every voice part as my voice went through the breaking process. And yes, so I learned a lot of repertoire, score reading, harmonization. Yes, I did go through the choral tradition. And I was at conservatoire from the age of 15, so I had a lot of musical training.
Let me ask you about the reception of the Italian solfeggio. This is a music history question. How is it thought of in other countries like France and Vienna and Germany? Surely, I mean, Italian music was dominant in that century. Even though they kept it a secret, people were listening to them perform. What was the reception of it outside of Italy?
Well, I mean, the solfeggio tradition was a professional craft training. So it only exists in professional circles, which we call conservatoires or church chapels or whatever. I mean, the word solfeggio was known, and it was used later in the 18th century as a marketing tool. So the Solfège d'Italie, for instance, that's a marketing name because it's saying to people, those castrati and those great Italian singers, you too could sing like this, if you buy this book. Basically what it means. But we know this story. I mean, Bob Jerningan's talked about this, how in the 18th century, the famous musicians were all Italians, and we forget them, we forget their names. But the great names, if you asked anyone in Europe who are the great musicians, they'd name Italians. They wouldn't name others.
I wanted to ask if you had been collaborating or at least sharing notes with people in historical performance, people who sing 18th century and 17th century and earlier music, and showed them your notes. And what has been the reception of your research?
Generally, I have tried to do that, but because the book isn't published yet, people generally think I'm mad. So whenever I talk, I mean, I'm talking about this with you now, and most people will think I'm completely crazy and just making all this up. But I do have a sort of 500-page book coming out, which gives a lot of evidence for it. So hopefully that will, back it up a little bit. But because I don't have the research published, when I talk about it, people tend to be very skeptical. But I have taught people this. I have taught it in conservatoires in the Netherlands and in Belgium and in Switzerland. I went to the Royal Academy recently and taught the students there. The reception I generally get is one of fascination, but they all say we want to know more about it. And what happens is I teach them and they say, well, this is fantastic. We'd love to do this, but there's nothing for them to use to teach themselves. So the quicker I can get this stuff published, the better. So I've got the book coming out, but the book is very much an academic book. It's to kind of ground the topic, and it's for scholars to look at and say, well, is he right? Is he wrong? Where's he made mistakes and this kind of thing, which is fair enough. But my next step will be a textbook for everybody. So I'm going to try and put this into a simplified step-by-step lesson 1, lesson 2 textbook, so that, for instance, a performer or a music teacher or a music student at any level can pick up the book and say, okay, I want to be able to do this. I want to understand this. And hopefully it will teach them. And I've worked out ways to do that.
Now, to prepare for your book when it is published next year, what would you like interested musicians who are probably wanting to sink their teeth into it, what do you think they should practice so that when they get the book, they're ready to go into it? What skills should they have in their back pocket?
Well, the crucial skill is just knowing what a hexachord is, and this is a real stumbling block, because it's only med-ren scholars who really know about these things nowadays. But it's essential. It was the basis of 18th century music, the 6-note scale. 7-note scale was the basis of partimento, that's without doubt. But the 6-note scale was the basis of 18th century music education, certainly in Italy. So I would advise them to get to know the Guido d'Arezzo system. It's not that difficult. All you have to know is that the scale is made up of 2 6-note scales, and they begin on the tonic and the dominant. So the first and the 5th notes of the scale are your do. There are 2 do syllables in the scale. So just getting familiar with that would really help, because that's a real stumbling block for most modern musicians.
If I want to go back to that whole perfect pitch thing. And a lot of people try it with their kids. As they go, when their kids are really young, they go to the piano and say, "This is do," and they repeat it. And then over a period of time, they sort of have this pitch memory or perfect pitch, so to speak. This is debatable, of course. But do you think in this way of learning solfeggio, that kind of pitch matching will be erased?
Well, it's up to the way it's taught. I mean, I'm firmly convinced that so-called perfect pitch is simply a matter of memory, because I have perfect pitch like that, but it's purely because I spent so long playing the piano that if I imagine a keyboard in my head, I can hear the notes, because I memorize them. Yep. So it's completely the way it's taught. I mean, if the teacher wants to teach memorization of pitches, then that's perfectly feasible. I mean, the students in the 18th century, they did learn the gamut, so they did know the letter names too, because they had to be able to pinpoint pitches.
Okay, so I have a question for that. So the letter names, did they use do or did they use C? Like the letter C?
No, they had both. So the letters of Gregory, which are from the sort of 7th century, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, those 7 letters are right there from the beginning of medieval music. And they're used to pinpoint pitches. So every note did have a letter name as well. So the way they did it was, if you wanted to name a note, you would name the letter and then all the syllables that could fall on that letter. So, for instance, it would be C, sol, fa, ut, because the letter C could have a sol, it could have a fa, and it could have an ut. So it was C, sol, fa, ut. So that's how they named the letters.
It's a very movable, do-ish sort of perception, I guess.
It developed over 7 centuries of unbroken tradition. And so by the 1750s, it had been going for 700 years, and it had developed in incredible ways to become fully chromatic, to accommodate chromaticism and key signatures. And I mean, it's quite different from the medieval Renaissance systems.
My next question is, this is for the long 18th century. And if we go into 19th century music, which is quote unquote progressive and chromatic and that sort of thing, is this system robust enough to accommodate the innovations of harmony that happened in the 19th and 20th century?
No. is the simple answer to that. It died out. The last great practitioners of this system, this Italian solfeggio tradition, are Bellini and Paganini. It's that generation. So we know that Bellini studied with Zingarelli at the Naples Conservatory, and we know from manuscript sources that he studied this old system, that he knew this system. So Bellini's melodies are very much within this tradition. And in fact, one could argue that later Italian opera keeps a lot of this shaping and this tradition. But of course, elsewhere it completely dies out. It dies out. I mean, I won't. If you want, I'll talk about the reasons why it died out. But
yes.
In composers in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, these kind of modern, progressive, new types of music for amateur markets. Yes, you're absolutely right. The old craft system of the 18th century was completely inadequate for the developments that took place. I mean, even though Wagner studied with the same teacher as Donizetti, a guy called Mattei, who knew the old system, the idea of trying to work out Wagner's music by way of this 18th century craft system is nonsense. Clearly it won't fit. So yes, it does die out, and no, the music of the 19th and 20th centuries, most of it will not fit with this system. It disappears.
Now, that being said, this is still an incredibly powerful system. There's works by Mozart that are incredibly dissonant as well. There is quite a lot of harmonic adventurism in for instance, partimento studies with dissonance handling and that sort of thing. Does that show up in solfeggi as well? Incredibly dissonant melodies and handling dissonance?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's different traditions. I mean, in Bologna, they had a very contrapuntal tradition of solfeggio, and there's some early 18th century ones which have solfeggi in whole tones, for instance, 1740s. If you go back even further than that, way back into the 17th century, there are all sorts of weird and bizarre chromatic and dissonant experiments with counterpoint and so on. So, I mean, this kind of thing's been going on since the Renaissance, really, these kind of weird experiments. But solfeggio, I would say that, I mean, I haven't got time to tell you all the details now, but the solfeggio system could accommodate any complex chromaticism. It could handle anything. It just didn't, because it wasn't very stylish. So it was a craft. I like to compare it to 18th century furniture making, where beautiful craft traditions survive in different places. But of course, there's a right way and a wrong way to do things, and you wouldn't expect sort of a Heppelwhite chair to have kind of, trendy Art Nouveau bits on the side. So, it doesn't travel well, this system. It's very much of a time and a place.
Please mention, how did it die out? Why did it die out?
Well, I mean, there are lots of reasons combined. I mean, number one, the most obvious one is the Napoleonic Wars. For about a generation, wars raged throughout Europe over the French Revolution and its consequences. And as a result of that, the French, wherever they went, they broke the connection between church and education. So all the church schools were disbanded, and secular public schools were sort of put in their place. And so the wonderful ancient tradition of church education was broken. And also they outlawed castrati. They outlawed castration in the castrati. And after a generation, they couldn't teach, and, the spoken thing disappeared. But the real reason, I mean, the number one reason why it disappeared is the loss of patronage, because it's really a craft system for bespoke industries for the church and aristocracy. And by the 1800s, neither of those institutions could afford to pay for their bespoke music industries. So the church could no longer afford to have these vast choirs and orchestras, in their churches. And similarly, the aristocracy could no longer afford to support their bands and orchestras in their houses. And so the money was to be made with the new middle class, selling music in sheet music or selling to the public. So the old craft traditions really just weren't needed anymore.
Now, you've done stellar work in this field. It's fair to say that you've really unlocked the core mysteries around solfeggio. Are there more mysteries? And do you have questions after all the 9 years of research that you've done? Are there still things that you are thinking about?
Well, I was very flattered because I wrote to Bob Jerningham about this when I discovered these traits in the manuscripts that show where the syllables were sung. And he wrote back to me and said, Nick, you've cracked the code, which is the most flattering thing I think anyone's ever said about my research. But yeah, so I sort of cracked the code, but I think I'm really just an infant when it comes to reading it. I think that there are a lot of secrets yet to be discovered. So, I mean, my level of understanding is of, let's say, a kind of 8 or 9-year-old at a Neapolitan conservatoire. I can do some basic stuff and I can understand and interpret, but there's an awful lot of this stuff which is beyond me, which is far too complex or sophisticated for me. And also, thousands of questions remain. It's not, I've cracked this code, if you like, but just interpreting some extremely complex manuscripts. I mean, there are still multiple questions over how we actually understand these things, because when there's no written evidence, you have to be like a scientist. You have to put forward the most plausible theory, test it. If it's wrong, get rid of it, or if you can amend it with practice. I think that actually the most fascinating thing for me about this is how it's going to play out amongst performers and musicians, and how they're going to use it. So what I don't want is for it to be just an academic discipline of interest to scholars of history. And they say, oh, back in those days, that's what they did. I mean, for instance, think of Paganini. Yeah, Paganini clearly learned his tradition through solfeggio. He's in the Tartini tradition, where they would play the violin, they would play solfeggi on the violin. So if you play do, re, mi on a violin, how many thousands of ways can you play do, re, mi on a violin? That's the Paganini tradition. Shall I do you a little Paganini? I'll do you a Paganini trick.
Absolutely,
if you like.
Yeah.
Would you like to hear this?
Yeah.
So Paganini's most famous melody is a solfeggio, and it's a solfeggio that has the first 5 notes of a minor scale, which in solfeggio are not 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're re, mi, fa, sol, la. And if I sing you a quick solfeggio, ready? Re, la, re, la, re, la, re, la, la, sol, sol, fa. Fa, mi, re, fa, mi, re. Very simple, yeah? 5 to 1. Listen to this. I'll do the same thing with the same syllables from the different hexachord. Re, la, sol, sol, fa, mi, re, fa, mi, re. And there we have Paganini's most famous caprice, and it's actually a solfeggio with what were called inganni, which are singing the wrong syllable to the wrong pitch to the right syllable.
Oh, what does that mean? We're singing the wrong pitch to the right syllable.
Well, every scale has 2 of each syllable. So there are 2 dos, there are 2 re's and 2 mi's. So if I sing, for instance, fa, sol, fa, mi, yep, that's 4, 5, 4, 3, fa, sol, fa, mi. If I do the other sol, listen, fa, sol, fa, mi. Yep, that's an inganno, that's a deception. It's a very common trick in 18th century solfeggio. So if someone like Paganini was doing that, what does that do for modern violinists? If they now know that's what he did, if you say, well, okay, you have a simple solfeggio and you play it in 1,000 different ways, his caprice number 24, there are not only 10 or 20 variations, there are 10,000 variations of that solfeggio. And what that will do to modern approaches to performance and ways of teaching, this is quite fascinating to me. And I don't have any answers. I don't have the answers. I'm just really keen to see what other musicians do with this information.
Just to end maybe on a provocative note, you mentioned earlier that you discarded quite a bit of information that you didn't find useful when trying to interpret solfeggio and this sort of tradition. You've gone through the training of a conservatory and as a pianist. Now you've done the solfeggio. What are the things that you really feel like you've discarded that people maybe should consider not putting so much emphasis on in conservatory training?
Wow, that's a big question. I went through the usual conservatory system, which is still in place in most parts of the world, where you basically learn to sonorize a score, which is inviolable. You're not allowed to change it. You can add a few ornaments if you're lucky, if you know how to do it.
You're lucky.
You add ornaments to the score. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a tradition that has its own history and its own purposes, and there's a lot of beautiful music that is performed, and I don't have any problem with that. But I think there is an alternative. I think that there are ways of learning this music and playing it in a slightly more individual way, and being slightly more creative and bringing back some of that creativity. So, for instance, it would be sacrilegious, but this is something I would do. If I were playing Mozart's sonata, the one that goes da 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 that I sang earlier, if I'm going to sing La Sol Fa Mi, why would I do it in that way? Why would I do it the way Mozart did it? I could do it in a different way that's actually better for me, that I play a better way. why not? So doing solfeggio changes your attitude, and I think that we've lost that creativity. Mozart would never expect anybody, in fact, even amateurs that he was teaching, to play the music exactly as written on the page. He would expect them to personalize it, to put their own stamp on it.
No kidding.
That's what I would like to see.
Well, on that note, Nicholas, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed talking to you, and this has been really a mind-blowing conversation. Yeah, would you like to mention a few events or projects or more research that are related to this, or just other things that you are working on?
We've got an exhibition in London in 2021 about this stuff, and there's all sorts of other things going on. We've got students at the Amsterdam Conservatorium and at Maastricht Conservatoire are working on this stuff. My students at Nottingham are too. So we've got students working on it already, which is feeding back really amazing results. I've got an Art of Solfeggio Facebook page, which is only just started, but we're trying to put some interesting stuff on there and get discussions going and get people learning about this stuff. And in 2021 at the Foundling Museum in London, just near the British Museum, I've got an exhibition coming up called Street Kids to Superstars, which is all about how orphanages were the X factor of their day.
That's fantastic. Well, Nicholas, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you for your amazing hard work and your stellar research in this area, and have a great rest of the day. I'll hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thanks for having me.